afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the 5th session of the U.S.-Singapore Indo-Pacific Conversation Series, held with support from the U.S. Embassy Singapore and in collaboration with the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. The theme of today's webinar is Maritime Security in Southeast Asia, Issues, Prospects, and Challenges for Cooperation. My name is Kristi Govella, and I'm the moderator for today's session. I am an assistant professor of Asian Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa and an adjunct fellow at Pacific Forum. Before we begin, I want to note that the views expressed by the speakers and myself as moderator do not necessarily reflect the views and official positions of the U.S. Department of State, the U.S. Embassy in Singapore, or the United States government. All views and opinions expressed in this webinar also do not necessarily reflect the positions of Pacific Forum or of the speaker's home institutions. Finally, all remarks, including those during the question and answer period, are on the record. So feel free to quote any part of this webinar for news reporting purposes. And we are live, not just through the Zoom platform, but also on Facebook. So please be mindful of these factors. So we're here today to discuss the incredibly important and complex topic of maritime security in Southeast Asia. And we are fortunate to have with us two very distinguished speakers to share their perspectives. With us today, we have Dr. Collin, who is Research Fellow and Coordinator of the United States Program at the Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. Collin is an expert on naval affairs in the Indo-Pacific, focusing on Southeast Asia in particular, and more generally on issues related to naval technologies, naval modernization, naval arms control, and offense-defense theory. Collin has published widely on these research topics, and I'm sure that many of you are familiar with his work. We also have with us today Mr. Blake Herzinger, a non-resident WSD Honda Fellow at Pacific Forum based in Singapore. Blake is an Indo-Pacific policy specialist and U.S. Navy Reserve officer. He spent nearly a decade in active service with the U.S. Navy as an intelligence officer with experience in the Middle East and across the Indo-Pacific. And he is broadly interested in security systems dynamics and sea power. So our session today will begin with presentations from our two speakers, and then we'll open up the floor for questions and answers from the audience. So feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A box at any time during the webinar, and we'll get to them when we get to the Q&A period. So with that being said, let's move right to the presentations with our speakers today. We'll begin with Dr. Collin.
Great. Good morning to every one of you, and of course, good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. I'm Collin, and I come from the S. Rajaratnam School, and just to use this opportunity for me on behalf of the institution to thank Pacific Forum, CSIS, for the opportunity to actually co-organize this series of webinar. And I'm fortunate as well to be given the opportunity to, provide my views on Southeast Asia maritime security. I really appreciate Professor Govella's presence here to moderate the session, and of course my good friend Blake. It's been some time since we met, and it's good to be on the same panel as you. And of course in the background, many thanks to Jeff for working with us on this. Now allow me to set the stage for discussion. It won't take likely more than 10 minutes, but I just want to set the stage for an overview of Southeast Asia's maritime security, and then we'll have more time subsequently for a discussion. Now, the title here for this webinar is on the issues, prospects, and challenges for cooperation, but I wanted to highlight a few points. I think the first point I want to highlight here is when it comes to the maritime security threat perceptions in this region. I think most of us will be very familiar with all the media reporting on the South China Sea disputes. It has very much occupied the minds of many readers. And of course, it's important to highlight here, coming from a Southeast Asian, that the South China Sea dispute is just one of the many issues that Southeast Asian countries are facing. It's important to also highlight that when it comes to the importance of the South China Sea dispute, it does vary quite widely amongst the 10 Southeast Asian countries within ASEAN. Some will regard the South China Sea dispute as very important and of great cruciality to their national interest, whereas for some they simply do not really care much about the South China Sea issues. But by and large, on a day-to-day basis, the preoccupation of Southeast Asian countries or coastal states, by and large, are tied with the more mundane or supposedly more mundane issues, like, for example, IUU fishing, smuggling, other transnational crimes such as theft, piracy, and armed robbery against ships, for instance. I think when it comes to how threat perceptions are being sensed in Southeast Asia, it's important to consider the domestic dimension of maritime security, whereby the political elites will need to maintain their legitimacy amongst their constituents. And therefore, with that, it's not just the provision of social economic goods that has been largely the bedrock of their legitimacy in the region, but also these days, they have to clearly demonstrate the will to safeguard their national sovereignty and rights, not least in the maritime domain. So the way we are seeing here is the primary approach undertaken by Southeast Asian countries will continue to be national self-help. And that's largely premised on the understanding that the policing of their sovereign and jurisdictional waters will continue to remain the primary or sole responsibility of the coastal states, whereas cooperation in other areas can take place with external parties. So I think that is a very basic understanding we have here when it comes to examining maritime security cooperation in this region. And now allow me to look at the current COVID-19 context, because it's important. It's sort of changed, or shifted the landscape a little when it comes to maritime security cooperation. I think right now, maritime forces in Southeast Asia are largely preoccupied with land and maritime border security control, and is largely against a scourge of smuggling, as well as drugs and human trafficking. Certain countries in Southeast Asia will continue to remain key regional transit hubs for the movement of illicit drugs, for example. So therefore, these transnational maritime security issues will continue to remain the preoccupation of these countries in the current COVID era. And of course, it's important to highlight here some of the challenges whereby the COVID-19 situation has exacted higher operational demands on assets and personnel of Southeast Asian maritime forces, and this is further aggravated by the required COVID-19 safety protocol that somehow will affect training, or affect the day-to-day operations of these maritime forces and agencies. And it's important to also highlight when it comes to national self-help is the focus on pandemic control and economic recovery strains finances for the maritime forces development. There'll be impact on new acquisitions and potentially even the routine upkeep of existing forces. Now, when it comes to national self-help, it's important to highlight here some nuanced dynamics. I think seen from the qualitative perspective, Southeast Asian maritime forces do actually boast some of the broader Indo-Pacific region's best capabilities. I mean, we're talking about, for example, state-of-the-art submarines, missile armed surface combatants, and even sophisticated offshore patrol vessels of the Coast Guards. These forces are largely designed for high-end peacetime deterrence, and they exist in smaller quantities within their broader force structures. And for some, it is questionable whether these somewhat token, amount of forces that are considered very state-of-the-art could be useful in times of high-end armed conflict. For low-intensity peacetime missions down the spectrum, there is less need for such high-end capabilities than more numerous low-end assets that suffice to deal with low-intensity scenarios that require mainly sustained presence of the forces. So in this case, for Southeast Asian countries, capacity here refers to two types of assets that we're talking about. One is for inshore and coastal duties. Southeast Asian maritime forces do actually have a large number of small patrol assets, and they do suffice for such a scenario. And when it comes to offshore duties, this is something that I believe, Southeast Asian countries, when it comes to national self-help, it tends to become problematic, that the assets that are optimized for long range, especially high endurance missions, they do exist in comparatively lower quantities. And there's always a funding conundrum that results in the need to balance between capability and capacity. And there's also the need to consider the inter-service rivalries that traditionally exist between the navies and the coast guards in Southeast Asia, whereas the navies will seek to maintain the leading position amongst all the other agencies. And therefore, they will tend to try to maximize their limited funding. And the proclivity here is to operate modular assets that can allow them to switch easily from peace to wartime missions. So largely when it comes to self-help for the Southeast Asian maritime forces, it's largely been more of a capacity issue that is a primary concern, more so than capability issues given their main priorities in peacetime. Now, so that's also one of the reasons why Southeast Asian governments are also very much into maritime security cooperation. Suffice to say is that there's no lack of practical maritime security initiatives in the region. I think the question here to me is one about efficacy of these existing mechanisms. We have here a hodgepodge of different mechanisms to consider. I think one is primarily bilateral cooperation that, which in my mind, constitutes the cornerstone of the habit of cooperation among Southeast Asian maritime forces and governments. And of course, we have to consider the multilateral ASEAN-wide mechanisms that actually mostly cater to what we call the lowest common denominator and usually touches on low-hanging fruits type of cooperation in the maritime domain because of certain geopolitical sensitivities. And not to also forget the US-led hub and spoke system of traditional alliances and security partnerships. And I think these days, we are seeing here a gradual proliferation of what we see as minilateral coalitions of the willing that actually comprise a small group of countries that share localized common threats in shared maritime spaces. And they build on habits of bilateral cooperation, and they usually are designed with the mind of sidestepping the limitations of broad multilateral frameworks. And we have here two examples in Southeast Asia, which some of you will be very aware about: the Malacca Straits Patrols and the Sulu Sea Trilateral Cooperative Arrangement. The Sulu Sea TCA is essentially based on the working model that came about with the Malacca Straits Patrol. So we have here in Southeast Asia a working template when it comes to practical security cooperation, even though the question has always been about the efficacy of information sharing and intelligence exchange, as well as national level interagency coordination and collaboration. And I think perhaps equally crucial being the capacity constraints of the individual participating countries in such frameworks. And so therefore, external parties' roles are largely not about policing those waters, but it's more with regard to capacity building, information sharing, intelligence exchange. So I want to use the remaining time to briefly touch on the role of the US. I think it's important to highlight here a few things that may not change going forward. I think given the COVID-19 situation, it's important to note that the priority of Southeast Asian countries will continue to be one on pandemic control and economic recovery. Traditionally, Southeast Asian countries have largely focused on social economic development and thereby devoting less resources and energy when it comes to their military forces development, Coast Guard development. And this is going to be very likely to remain the case going forward. We have here some domestic conundrum that Southeast Asian political elites are facing. On the one hand, they are expected to continue to demonstrate the will to safeguard those national maritime sovereignty and rights. But at the same time, they are also expected to spend more money on public health care, social security, and big ticket items for purchasers when it comes to maritime forces development tend to create some debate in their countries. And so therefore, it does actually bind the hands and legs of the regional countries. So therefore, I think going forward, we're going to see limited procurement and modernization efforts in the foreseeable few years during this post-pandemic era. At the same time, greater emphasis on cooperation with external parties, not least the US. The US is still going to continue to be seen as a key stabilizing force in the region. My only question here is that, with the whole gamut of pre-existing maritime security cooperation mechanisms, what else can Southeast Asian countries do with the US? I mean, are there any room for further expansion, any further deepening of those cooperative initiatives, for example? And whether or not, the role of the other external parties could be brought in that could help to synchronize with the US capacity building assistance to Southeast Asian countries. So we have here so far, Southeast Asian countries turning to various external parties to get capacity building assistance. Now, the bigger question here is, are these efforts coordinated? Are these efforts synchronized so we don't actually have duplication of effort so that we can maximize limited resources in this part of the world? In this case, we have here joining the US, the role of Japan, Australia, India, and even these days, talk about some of the European powers like France coming to the picture to help to build those capacity. So what is the way going forward? I believe this is something, that we can discuss further, and I will defer to Blake, when it comes to, the greater details on US maritime security capacity building in this part of the world. So with that, I end my presentation and hand over to Professor Govella. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those comments. So let's move directly to the next presentation by Blake.
All right, thanks very much. Thanks, Collin, for setting a impossibly high bar to match, and thanks very much to Dr. Govella for facilitating today. Aloha to all our participants. I see a lot of friends on the line, and thank you to the Pacific Forum and U.S. Department of State and RSIS for sponsoring this event. I'm going to share some slides here. So bear with me for 1 second while I get that going. Okay. All right. So I'm going to offer kind of a perspective on maritime security, largely from a U.S. Navy and maritime law enforcement perspective. I'll touch on a few other things as we go, but I'm going to come at this kind of teed up nicely by Collin. I'll breeze through this because Collin's covered it very well. The maritime domain, as we all know, is interconnected, which means there are no problems that occur in a vacuum. This is my neighbor's problems are my problems. That runs the gamut of threats, degradation of the environment, terrorism, kidnapping for ransom, things like piracy and sea robbery. These are all shared challenges, right? They don't affect one nation. They start on shore, they move into the sea, and all the countries in the region share these same threats. I think if you ask any Navy or Coast Guard or law enforcement organization, they would all list these same threats as their priorities, but they might rank them differently. Kind of where you sit depends on how severe it is. All countries in Southeast Asia don't have a territorial dispute, but those territorial disputes do bleed over into other areas, and they degrade good order at sea, which affects all nations. So on that, I think it's a question of framing, and this is something that's really important for any state attempting to get involved in maritime security in Southeast Asia. There's maybe a propensity for things to become all about China, and that becomes very unproductive very quickly. There's revisionist state behavior, yes, but we can't say that the PRC is the only country that is doing things like that degrade good order at sea. Illegal fishing, the People's Republic of China operates the world's largest fishing fleet, likely engages in the largest scale illegal fishing globally, but it's certainly not the only state engaged in illegal fishing. The island building campaign in the South China Sea has been incredibly detrimental to the environment, but the Chinese are not the only country conducting land reclamation. And that's a talking point that I think we see come from the Chinese. It's certainly, there's no comparison in the scale, but we can't talk about all these issues as if there's only one guilty party, and it doesn't become helpful to try and organize collective behavior necessarily pointing one way on these behaviors when it's kind of a shared security issue. So the politics on things like fishing are complicated. So security, just like insecurity, are shared. It requires a cooperative approach to maintain good order at sea, and that's something that's important to recognize. I think there's a mismatch often in things that are important in Southeast Asia as compared to other states that might participate in things like maritime security in the region. There's something called non-traditional security, which I'm sure most are familiar with, but those non-traditional security factors are traditional security in Southeast Asia. Terrorism, insurgency, narco trafficking, human trafficking, those are things that navies and coast guards deal with every single day. It is very much traditional. You know, the things that larger navies might want to think about more, ships shooting at other ships, that's pretty rare. But the things that are very much at the forefront of the consciousness of organizations in Southeast Asia are things that are not necessarily #1 priorities for other navies. So that requires a change in paradigm and a shift in thinking. From the US side, the new Tri-Service Maritime Strategy does outline some of this, with the Navy and the Coast Guard kind of being told to start engaging more with these ideas and realizing that they are very important. And when we engage with partners in Southeast Asia, these are the issues we need to think about. It's not talking about, you know, high-end warfare necessarily. We can do those things together, but other things that are more important are ensuring a free sea, you know, helping to ensure fish stocks remain viable to feed coastal populations. And then, you know, we all share the same challenges in coordination. Navies and Coast Guards battle over budgets, navies battle with armies over budgets. And as Collin mentioned, there's a traditional overweight to armies in Southeast Asia in most cases. So navies have been disadvantaged. And then often the Coast Guards have been carved out of those navies. So the Navy will protect its budget against its own Coast Guard. So it can be quite difficult. But kind of getting into what the US does as far as maritime cooperation with ASEAN in particular. So there's the ADMM Plus. The US currently co-chairs the Maritime Security Working Group with Thailand. Now, this is something that I think we could do a lot more with. I would like to see more US cooperation and kind of engagement on the ASEAN side. I think that's something generally shared. It's maybe a common complaint. I know it's something that we hear a lot in Southeast Asia. You know, why is representation maybe not what we would hope? Why are we not pursuing things like broader engagement with ASEAN work plans, things like that? So I think the ADMM Plus poses an interesting challenge where the US could engage more and keep working. But one great example of cooperation there, I think, was the ASEAN-US Maritime Exercise that took place in 2019. There was a broad comparison with the ASEAN-China Maritime Exercise, certainly. The US position was that the US exercise was not a reaction to the Chinese exercise, but I think it does display kind of the dynamic that is occurring. Any participation by either of the larger powers with ASEAN is going to be seen as something that needs to be met or countered or equaled. So it puts ASEAN in a maybe uncomfortable position of capacity. You know, how many exercises can we afford to do with China and the US? If it becomes an every year thing, you know, the ADMM is going to be overloaded with planning. But for the US, this was a great opportunity to engage with countries within ASEAN that usually maybe we don't. At the time, countries like Myanmar and Cambodia and Laos that were involved in the exercise that wouldn't usually be security partners of the US for one reason or another. Moving on, so the Cooperation Afloat Readiness and Training Exercise Series, CARET. So that's the US system of bilateral maritime exercises in the region. It started off in the 1990s. So people that are familiar with the exercise have seen a lot of changes. It used to be organized around a task force of ships and Marines, and they would sail through the region doing exercise after exercise. And it was, you know, there's thousands of personnel, large numbers of ships, and very large ships. So something that we've seen as the US fleet has kind of been pulled in a lot of different directions and lost a lot of ships is that it's difficult. It's really difficult to put this series together. It doesn't operate around this task force format anymore because frankly, we can't put together that many ships and Marines for that long anymore. So These events are planned, they're planned together. There's a large conference that takes place, but most of the planning goes on bilaterally. Forces are allocated bilaterally. And that, I think, poses a challenge to the model. The group of countries that are involved has also changed. So at the beginning, there were 5 countries in Southeast Asia that were part of the CARET series. Later on, we've added Bangladesh, we've added Sri Lanka, Cambodia has dropped out. Vietnam has a similar to CARET, but not CARET. They have naval engagement activity. We also have a naval engagement activity sama-sama with Philippines because they don't have the CARET thing. So what we had in the mid-90s is almost unrecognizable to what exists today. So that model, may need to change. Countries like Singapore, if you want to say, kind of graduated from this CARET model into a higher end warfighting exercise, Pacific Griffin. Maybe this becomes, just a series of bilateral exercises that aren't necessarily related. But that's something, for consideration. And I think each country is going to have a different trajectory. But maybe maintaining the model does offer something for countries to come back to. For broader Southeast Asian cooperation altogether, the Southeast Asia Cooperation and Training Exercise, CCAT, is kind of the crown jewel for U.S. maritime security cooperation. And it focuses on those same issues that Collin and I have talked about, kind of the non-traditional security issues, things like fishing, illegal fishing, things like human trafficking. It came about in the very, very close to 9/11 era. So it used to be a terrorism-focused exercise. The T used to be for terrorism. We changed the name in 2012 to kind of make it broader maritime security. And this is somewhere where I think the U.S. has really been able to do a good job in bringing in other elements of naval or sea power, right? Not just navies, not just gray hulls, but the Coast Guard, working with other multilateral partners like the EU and UN ODC to kind of bring together this maritime community that reflects more accurately the challenges that Southeast Asia faces. MDA, that's something that has been incorporated recently in most of the CARET exercises as well as CCAT. I think there's been a lot of work done on this that's very, very good. But in the past, when the U.S. has done MDA cooperation and building capacity, it's kind of been building radars, building, watch centers. But really, the future of MDA is space, and it's cheap. It's subscription-based models. These are things that maybe we don't have to invest heavily on hardware, and we kind of get into this space where we can offer a lot more bang for the buck. And it doesn't require quite as much investment of personnel and construction. And it creates an interesting space for security cooperation, like Collin mentioned, as opposed to in-person, cooperation against a defined state threat. We can do things like information sharing, and that's something that's key to get more cooperation on. I know it's a challenge in the U.S. Because often we want to kind of hold on to information, we overclassify. States in Southeast Asia can be oversensitive with their data as well and resist sharing with each other, resist sharing with the US. There's a lot of sensitivities there. But that's somewhere that I hope we do see increased cooperation. I know that's something that the US Pacific Fleet's working hard on. Again, more on the shared awareness, of course. So the IFC here in Singapore, the Information Fusion Center, they have something called the Shared Awareness Meeting. So I think unshared awareness is really what we worry about. Building too many information fusion centers can maybe pose a challenge. If those proliferate to a certain degree, how many countries can afford to send a liaison officer to 10 different information fusion centers? So it's kind of, we have to dial in that effort and find how many is the right number. The existing centers, Singapore being a leader in the region, are really great. They do an excellent job, but I think each center reflects, its own national priorities. They kind of focus on specific issues, national interest. Indonesia has built the IMIC Center, which is more internally focused, but I think there's an argument to be made there that they built IMIC because they disagreed with the numbers that were being reported by other centers. So to the extent that some of these centers become a way for states to not push an agenda, but defend their point of view, I think that has to be recognized when we talk about MDA and awareness that there is an element of national interest here and narrative. Something I think is always worth talking about, engaging with Southeast Asia on its own merits. There's a tendency to let China dominate conversations, and I think that's something that nobody in Southeast Asia really wants to hear, right? No, that idea won't generate engagement. It will push partners away. It makes ideas that might be good actually become radioactive. If you make it all about China, ideas just won't succeed. There's the popular saying, rowing between two reefs. Southeast Asia can't avoid geography, right? There's a very, very large neighbor to the north. There's no way to split that in a way that Southeast Asia will feel comfortable with. So making it about competition as opposed to cooperation is just something that isn't going to work in Southeast Asia, and I hope that's something we can all recognize. I also think there's a weakness in the Southeast Asian narrative about not forcing choices. Some things do involve choices. There are choices made every day. Governments will make choices. And you can't fault a state that relies on China for economic benefit for choosing China sometimes. It will happen. So the idea that choices aren't going to be made, I think, is a false one. I think that's an unfortunate argument. And I think we also need to, on the US side, be careful that we're not assuming, if we do force choices or if there are choices made, we need to be realistic about the results of those discussions and how those, the outcomes of those choices. Sometimes China will be the one that's chosen, and that's just the way it is. I'm going to get through these because I don't want to run over time. A lot of things that we've done wrong in the past from the US side. I think most of Southeast Asia is pretty resistant to an idea of an Asian NATO or some sort of combined maritime force. I've got examples in the background there from CETO. Nobody wants that, right? We're not looking for that. Things that worked elsewhere won't necessarily work in Southeast Asia, just with a different name. It requires tailored solutions. It requires unique solutions. The U.S. has a long legacy here, both of good and bad. I think we could, as a nation, could be more cognizant of that fact. We can't necessarily push. We can't push too hard sometimes, or if we do push, being aware of legacies that exist, I think, is important. Finding a way to craft our own strategy in a way that shows empathy and shows recognition of past mistakes, I think, is very, very important. I think it's something we could always do better at. We need to be aware of what's happened in the past and be aware that people remember and people think about those things when they make decisions. And Collin mentioned, domestic politics. I mean, all politics are local. And so we can't push too hard on things without understanding what's happened before. So just kind of wrapping up, I think some trends are very, very good. We have deep, long-standing relationships across the region. We have deepening defense ties in the region. But some indicators don't look great. Gray zone activities, particularly from the PRC, we've found it challenging to counter those and to respond effectively. Some environmental factors are in free fall, and I don't know if we'll be able to arrest those before they have catastrophic impacts. Human security is something that the region battles with. We see refugee crises, a government that's about to fail. There are serious issues that require a collective response, really. And I think it's important to recognize that the things that we did before now are not what we should do in the future. What got us here won't get us where we're going. We need to find new creative solutions to these problems, not repackage things that we did before. So with that, apologize for running a bit over, and I'll turn it back to Kristi.
Great, thank you, Blake, for your comments. So the two speakers have covered a wide range of potential topics for discussion, which is great. They made a number of excellent, often nuanced points about everything from history, national priorities, non-traditional security, spillover across issues, domestic political factors, inter-service rivalries, proliferation of cooperative mechanisms, and then the challenges of coordination and efficacy. So I think there's a lot on the table, and I'm looking forward to hopefully a lively discussion. So I will exercise my moderator's prerogative here and kick off things with a question to just get us started before we move to questions from our audience. And as I'm asking my question, I'd remind you that for audience members, if you'd like to ask a question, you can either use the raise hand function and we'll call on you to unmute and ask your question directly to the speakers, or you can type your question in the Q&A box at any time and I'll read your question. So in either case, please remember to give us your name and your affiliation so that we know who we're speaking with. So my question to kick things off, so to pick up on a point that Collin mentioned briefly at the end of his comments, I'm curious for our two speakers, could you tell us, what role you see extra-regional powers besides the US playing in maritime security in Southeast Asia? So for example, who do you see as the key actors? Are they operating mostly bilaterally or perhaps in unilateral configurations such as the Quad? And with what specific issues do you see them being most engaged? So Collin alluded to defense capacity building, which is definitely a key one, but are there other ones where you really see these extra regional actors playing a role? And, in general, with whichever actors you choose, do you see them as promoting cooperation, or are there some cases in which they're actually exacerbating divisions in Southeast Asia? So whoever would like to start.
So maybe I will start first. Thank you so much, Professor Govella, for your question. You asked about the role that will be played by other extra-regional powers besides the US. And immediately, which comes to my mind will be Australia and Japan. I think it's important to note that Australia has been playing a long-standing role when it comes to, maritime security cooperation in Southeast Asia. Like, for example, back in the 1980s, Australia has started an initiative called Operation Gateway. And that actually, envisages Australian maritime patrol aircraft flying to Southeast Asia and, providing, maritime domain awareness, like, assistance to regional countries, and so contributed to that. And, one of the, key achievements of this sort of arrangement was, a few years back when an oil tanker was being hijacked in the regional waters. It was an Australian maritime patrol aircraft that spotted a suspicious vessel with the name being changed by the hijackers and passed on the information to Southeast Asian littoral states. So Australia has been playing that role largely in terms of information sharing as well as providing training. The type of cooperation that Australia provides, Southeast Asia tends to be very different from the one that it provides to its Pacific island neighbors. For example, there is a Pacific Patrol Boat Program, and these days we know of it to be the Pacific Maritime Security Program, whereby Australia will provide patrol boats to the Pacific island countries. This initiative has not yet been replicated in Southeast Asia, which I believe it might be helpful go along that, because the type of capacity that is required by Southeast Asian coast guards is precisely the type of capacity that the Pacific Island countries are receiving from Australia. So I think this is probably one area that I believe Australia stands in a good position when it comes to its role other than the US. The other country I can think about is Japan. I think that largely piggybacks on the long-standing Japanese involvement in Southeast Asia when it comes to post-1945 investments and ODA, and that helped to create a reservoir of goodwill between Southeast Asian countries and Japan. And as generations went by, the older generations started to fade away, the wartime memories had started to fade away as well. So that actually does position Japan in a very unique position. I recall a survey that was done by the ISIS Yusof Ishak Institute that surveyed the elite attitude in this region, and Japan actually ranked very highly when it comes to its position other than the US in the perceptions in the region. So I believe Japan does have a reservoir of goodwill that can tap on when it comes to providing those security assistance. But I believe Japan is somewhat constrained when it comes to the type of assistance they can provide. largely we see Japan providing Coast Guard assistance to the region. But of course, these days we are seeing here the Japan Ministry of Defense providing some form of assistance to some of the countries. But I think in some cases, it's unavoidable to see capacity building assistance being politicized. I think in some ways it will be politicized, right? So I think more importantly is that these various actors outside Southeast Asia bring in unique capabilities that are required by the region. So I think the issue here is how to bring all of this together so there won't be any overlap. So in this case, for Australia and Japan, it appears that there is minimal overlap when it comes to the assistance to this part of the world. And in some cases, I see as these actors at times becoming more attractive to Southeast Asia, especially in the midst of intensifying US-China rivalry. So Japan and Australia tends to be looked upon as so-called the third alternative way forward. If not the US way, if not China way, then you can turn to these other actors as a way to build your capacity. So that's just my sharing of to your question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Collin, and thanks for a great question, Dr. Govella. So I think Collin mentioned the Quad, and I think there's a lot of buzz around the Quad. What does it do? First of all, like why is the Quad? I think one of the most interesting potential uses for that forum is to deconflict these types of partner capacity building efforts, because all four of those states, Collin very, very rightly mentioned, Japan has played an outsized role in security cooperation and capacity building for decades. John Bradford, who I don't think is online today, but he's done some great work on tracing their ODA and the ways that they've helped Coast Guards. But in a lot of places, these efforts, if they're not working at cross purposes, they're unaligned. So I think the Quad offers a great opportunity to kind of put everything on the table. Here's what's happening. Here's where we can help. And we don't have to do it together in the application, but at least if we kind of know what's happening between those four large donors and capacity building states, it would build a lot of efficiency. The EU, I think, with their Crimario initiative coming in through the Indian Ocean region and into Southeast Asia, I think that's an interesting one. I think, I know the 7th Fleet is working a lot with Crimario. I think there's a lot of room for better coordination there because we're starting to see a lot of proliferation of different maritime domain awareness tools. The EU has their own, Singapore has their own, the US has their own. And eventually, there's a kind of a tools in a toolbox approach. Hey, there's a lot of great tools out there. We can use them for their individual strengths. But at some point it becomes too many tools, right? And then we start dropping coordination and that becomes a problem. So I think that's something that will need to be improved. The UK and France, obviously in the last year or two, we've seen a lot of increased engagement. The UK is planning to base an OPV in the region or rotationally deploy. They're sending a carrier strike group into the region. France has, territory that they hold across the region. I mean, UK has Diego Garcia. So they are regional actors. When you look at them, they've just been less present. So that's gonna keep going, and I think that's positive. Just with increased coordination. And I think one of the interesting things, if you look at, US Indo-Pacific Command, the J5, who is in charge of things like security cooperation, is British. That's a Royal Navy Commando brigadier who does that job. So I think that highlights kind of the US position on how these efforts get tied together. And I think that's something to replicate. As far as states that maybe will continue to participate and might not be super constructive, I think there is a obvious role that Russia plays, at least in terms of hardware in the region. Russia has increasingly patrolled the region when they could. Their Pacific Fleet is not their strongest, certainly, but visits to the Philippines and elsewhere, their past role, in Vietnam. So the Russian Navy will continue to be present in the region. But I think one of the telling things is that the major needs for Southeast Asia, I think you can sum them up within maritime domain awareness and maritime security. And those are not areas where Russia and the PRC participate constructively. There are no Russia-China projects helping states observe their own EEZ, right? Because one of those states in particular has a vested interest in regional states not knowing what's happening in their EEZ and not being able to contest, revisionist actions in their EEZs. So there are no radar projects that the Chinese are sponsoring because they don't want states to see what's happening out there. They're not sponsoring, information fusion because they don't want states to share. So I think that's a pretty clear indication of intent in the region. So yeah, that's all from me.
Great, thanks to both of you. We have some great questions piling up. So let's go to a live question from Hunter Marston.
Hi, Kristi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thanks for the opportunity to pose a question. And thank you to both of the speakers for their illuminating remarks. Actually, my question sort of builds on where Blake just left things. And I'm hoping perhaps Collin would be willing to touch on this too. But Blake noted the sort of false frame of "don't make us choose," which we hear so often in Southeast Asia or regarding Southeast Asian states' alignment decisions. And yet we've seen Southeast Asian states cooperating with both US in the maritime domain and maritime exercises, as well as deepening their defense cooperation with China at the same time. About a year and a half ago, we saw China and Singapore upgrade their defense agreement to expand basing or not basing, but security cooperation and defense exchanges. So I'm wondering, perhaps the reasons for cooperation with the United States and with China might be different. Blake said that Southeast Asian states don't really benefit from maritime domain awareness and provision of such public goods from the PRC. But what are the reasons a state like Singapore would cooperate with China beyond perhaps just binding it into a more friendly relationship? Do Southeast Asian states like Singapore actually derive tangible benefits from security cooperation with China? Thanks.
Great. Does one of you want to pick up on that?
Sure. Hey, Henry, good morning. Thanks for your question. So yeah, I think there are some, whether it's a benefit or a necessity, the PLAN is a fact, right? It is one of the world's largest navies. By some metrics, it is the world's largest navy. So it is going to be in Southeast Asia. It's going to be in the Indian Ocean. It's going to pass through the Strait of Singapore and then Strait of Malacca. Navies, regardless of their politics, have to have ways that they communicate. They have to be at least somewhat familiar with one another. The ocean is a big place, right? They have to be able to operate around one another without colliding, shooting each other. So there is some element of necessity-driven cooperation there, I think. I think Southeast Asia, has tried to play this both ways as well. The ASEAN-China maritime exercise, you saw some cooperation there on things like disaster response, simulated ferry sinking, things like that. Because again, regardless of politics, if a ferry sinks and both states have to respond, they have to figure out a way to do that. If there is an ASEAN event, or if there's a very large humanitarian assistance or disaster response event, another 2004 tsunami, God forbid, it's likely that the PRC would respond in some way. So those navies have to be able to at least deconflict their operations, if not work together. Combat operations probably aren't going to happen. That kind of cooperation is unlikely. But things like HADR, those are likely. So it's something they need to be able to do.
Yeah, just to tag on to what Blake has mentioned, I think, Blake, you're right. I mean, in a way, it is unavoidable for Southeast Asian countries when it comes to, the Chinese coming to you and asking to cooperate in those defense and security exchanges. I think, in a way, it's natural because I think China has long ago, started to argue that, there has been a very buoyant, vibrant economic relationship with Southeast Asian countries, but the partnership hasn't been very holistic. So they wanted a more holistic partnership. They wanted something that can allow them to explore defense and security exchanges and cooperation. Some of the Chinese interlocutors I spoke to mentioned about the imbalance where there is this amount of economic cooperation, but when it comes to security cooperation, it has always been down at the bottom. So for some of them, they even argue that if Southeast Asian countries can enjoy strong economic and investment ties with the US, and yet at the same time have such developed exercises such as Karat exercises, then why not do it with us as well? But the issue here, which I thought was important to highlight, is I think it is a structural, pragmatic issue. I think on the one hand, we see political will on both sides. I mean, China wants those exercises of cooperation, and Southeast Asian countries, in a way, also somewhat feel obliged to consider those considerations. But at the same time, it's important to note there are actually some differences when it comes to the organizational culture, when it comes to the training and the type of procedures that the PLA Navy operates on vis-a-vis those Southeast Asian navies work on. So there are limitations to the extent, the depth to which those cooperation can take place. But I think something that I thought was interesting and that was not very much highlighted is that besides the PLA Navy, the China Coast Guard has been cooperating quite closely with Southeast Asian countries, largely dealing with seaborne smuggling. And if we put aside what the China Coast Guard is doing in the South China Sea with regards to the dispute, the CCG has largely been very productive in cultivating those relationships with its Southeast Asian counterparts, dealing with transnational issues. So I think this is one area that we cannot overlook, and I think it is going to be increasingly important. And I echo Blake by saying that I think Southeast Asian countries do see value in maintaining those warm ties and warm links with PLA Navy and the CCG, so that when it comes to any potential contingencies, there is a way to communicate and there's a way to cooperate. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks to both of you. So we have a number of questions in the Q&A box. I think I'm going to combine a couple of different ones from Dr. Jim Corcoran at Hawaii Pacific University and Ann Shao. And they're both asking about sort of the flip side of what we were just talking about, which is China's more divisive actions in the South China Sea. So in combination, they ask, how do you picture China's increasingly forceful presence in the near term in the South China Sea? How has China's fait accompli in the South China Sea been accepted differently among different Southeast Asian countries? What actions could be taken to blunt China's activities in the South China Sea? And do you think divergent attitudes among Southeast Asian countries affect the potential for cooperation with the US going forward? So there's a lot there. So if each of you want to pick up maybe just a couple key points and share, that would be great. Maybe starting with Collin.
Great. Thank you so much for the questions, and thank you, Professor, for combining them together, because I was looking at the list as well and wondering how to answer them systematically. Okay. I think when it comes to the Chinese actions in the near term, I think we've reached a point, I mean, Blake, you can disagree with me, that I think China has reached a point where its growing physical ability to control and project force in the South China Sea has given it greater comfort and confidence in terms of its current position in the South China Sea. I think, generally it has reached a point where, it has succeeded in ensuring that a divided ASEAN will not amount to any significant action against what it's doing in the South China Sea, save for the discrete individual member state actions, such as, submission of a note verbal, as well as other discrete actions undertaken by each of them. So in the near term, I think China is comfortable with this position and is going to continue to consolidate this position. And of course, the response from Southeast Asia to this fait accompli is, I think a mixture of resignation and as well as, some response to show China that not all is lost. I think there is some misunderstanding especially in the mainstream media, that Southeast Asian countries are by and large weak, they are small, and therefore they are prone to lie all over and get rolled over by China. That's not really true. I think one thing to note is that Southeast Asian countries by and large tend to avoid a megaphone diplomacy with China as far as possible. But then again, if we see the ground action, it could be quite different. Like for example, while on the one hand, Malaysia has been very cordial to China and avoided calling out China in the public media. But on the ground, the Malaysian Maritime Forces have tried to counter China's presence by maintaining their own presence as far as possible and as far as their Maritime Forces capacity could allow. So that is what they are doing. Going forward, when it comes to dealing with this sort of gray zone coercion or actions, I think it goes way beyond just putting ships and planes into the area. I think it's important to highlight here that it is important to build economic resilience of Southeast Asian countries, because if you agree with me that by and large, this fait accompli is possible, and Southeast Asian countries find themselves hamstrung largely because they believe that their economic partnership with China is so important that they will either take no action or take minimal action. Then the only way forward is to build these economic resilience by, for example, diversifying their export markets away from China, diversifying their investment sources from China. And that gives them more leeway to respond to China in a more decisive manner. And it also signals to China that Southeast Asian countries are not necessarily in its pocket when it comes to this economic interdependence. And if I want to touch a little bit on the divergent views and actions undertaken by Southeast Asian countries and the implication for cooperation with the US, I think that is something that has been ongoing for a while, because even if you put aside China, I think the divergent threat perceptions in Southeast Asia has somewhat created by design the need for US maritime capacity building and other forms of assistance to individual Southeast Asian countries in a tailored manner. I mean, as what Blake has mentioned earlier, that there is no one common framework for the US to approach maritime security cooperation with the Southeast Asian countries. So it has to be very much, context dependent on each individual Southeast Asian partner and ally. And with that, I will hand over to Blake for you to share your views. Thank you.
Thanks, Collin. I echo all of Collin's points here. I think there is an element of resignation to this issue, not necessarily abandoning it, but the fait accompli in many respects is not going to be rolled back. What is there out there that could incentivize the Chinese to withdraw from their holdings in the South China Sea? I would submit that there is not anything short of war that will push the Chinese off those islands. They're not giving them up. There are maybe ways to reinforce the region against further expansion, and I think that's where the line has to be drawn at this point. What can be done, and Collin mentioned, reinforcing economies and diversifying, allowing states within Southeast Asia to have giving options, essentially. And honestly, I think part of this is emotionally upsetting to some US policymakers, because they don't like hearing balancing and hedging, but continuing to work to build that space, but then sometimes, also still kind of being on the receiving end of a few flame sprays from the region, or not necessarily getting the unalloyed, yes, we want to be your, only your security partner. You're not going to get that exclusivity. So it's not thankless, but it's also not this unalloyed, if we do X, we will win Singapore, we will win Thailand. There will be no binary winning and losing, right? Unless something extreme happens. There is balance, and that requires nuance. And I think that's something that we are hopefully learning more and more. Picking what wins are important, and helping to create that space for Southeast Asia. I know there's a question in there on the code of conduct. The code of conduct negotiation, I think, is just this protracted mess. I don't think there's anything for ASEAN to win there, any ultimate result. will not protect Southeast Asia and will maximize Chinese freedom of maneuver. I think that's generally accepted. But maybe there's still some utility in continuing that process, because ASEAN can use that as evidence that they're still trying, but China is refusing to be a constructive partner. China, I think Collin's absolutely right, is increasingly comfortable with its position in the South China Sea, and I know I've seen Collin comment on a number of the choices that the Chinese have made in what vessels they put into the South China Sea. Constabulary vessels, rescue vessels, trying to create this impression that they both control and protect the region, right? We are this giant security provider. We're here to, so many of these islands began as quote unquote, shelters for fishermen. Like, sure, okay, right, yeah. You're a white painted former PLAN destroyer that's there to protect fishermen, right? But you'll see more of that. And then I think as that position continues to consolidate, increasing PLAN presence, which is already there, fighters, bombers, surveillance aircraft, destroyers, frigates, those kinds of things will increasingly operate in the South China Sea, and that's a fact. Different states have responded differently. Some have effectively bandwagoned with China within ASEAN to hamstring effective ASEAN response. Others have taken action to bulk up their naval forces. Indonesia has recently announced a large plus up to their naval budget. Vietnam acquired modern Kilo submarines, which are very, very effective SSK, so very quiet diesel power propelled submarines. And that's some of those gaps and seams are very interesting, because you see Russia supporting Vietnamese defense objectives that actually are in contraposition to Chinese objectives. So that dynamic is interesting. This kind of Russia, Southeast Asia, China dynamic. It's not always Russia running interference for the Chinese. Sometimes they're greatly impeding the Chinese, and I think Vietnam's a great example of that. The Philippines Navy continues to pursue submarines, as a deterrent likely to the Chinese. Singapore's Navy is, Singapore's not a South China Sea claimant, but existentially dependent on freedom of the seas, excuse me. So you see a very robust, very capable Navy in the Republic of Singapore Navy. So yeah, I think responses across the region are going to differ. They're going to change, and they're not going to be static. They will continue to reevaluate and adjust based on the state of play in the region.
Great, thank you both. To combine a couple questions on this theme, we've just been talking a little bit about gray zone activity, and there is interest in this among the audience. So Han Wen and Chad Norberg in combination ask about if you could expand a bit on the dangers associated with gray zone activity. You've already touched upon it, but if there's anything else you'd want to add, what possible mitigation options exist to address these challenges? Do you think that law enforcement cooperation in non-traditional security will become more prevalent in Southeast Asia? And how efficient is law enforcement cooperation vis-a-vis gray zone activities? Maybe we'll start with Blake this time.
Sure thing. So great question. To the extent that gray zone activities can be countered, they're obviously designed to not be countered or to be difficult to counter. Awareness and transparency, I think, are the building blocks of countering that. Using available legal frameworks. I think we saw kind of the season of démarches from Southeast Asia. I think that was an important sign that, even if we can't stop or counter facts on the ground or things that are happening, we can still continue to kind of bang that drum at an international level that states in the region do not agree with what the Chinese are doing. And that's important. The US is often criticized about having this FONOPS only strategy, which I think is, is a totally false narrative, first of all. But second of all, FONOPS are important. We keep doing them because freedom of navigation is important. It is a sign of non-concurrence and disagreement with something that a state is doing. And if you stop, eventually this whole, what's the saying, I'm going to butcher the quote, but if you don't say anything and you don't act, eventually you've just agreed. You're not contesting facts on the ground. You're not contesting behavior. So that's important. And I think Southeast Asia actually has some really interesting elements of very pragmatic maritime law enforcement cooperation. Collin mentioned the trilateral cooperative arrangement. There are multiple territorial disputes and maritime boundary disputes involved in that region, yet 3 Southeast Asian states have been able to kind of shelve those, or at least kind of just ring fence them and say, okay, well, we need to cooperate on terrorism here. So we can kind of put these border disputes to bed. We can find a way to work around them and be productive in the Sulu Sea and Celebes Sea. So I think, yeah, we hopefully will continue to see things like that. And I think Southeast Asia does have that pragmatic aspect that allows it to put some important issues aside and still cooperate without making it all about the disagreements.
Just want to, echo what Blake has mentioned, talk about gray zone and the responses that Southeast Asian countries can put up against gray zone actions undertaken by, other parties. I think, a good example here would be just recently, there was, part of the face-off between the Filipinos and the Chinese in the South China Sea. There was an instance when the Philippine Coast Guard approached a group of Chinese fishing vessels that are, believed to be maritime militia, and they were warned away without any further incident. Even though there were actually Chinese Coast Guard vessels nearby, but the Coast Guard vessel did not take any action because earlier there had been some concerns whether China will use these particular incident as a way to test its Coast Guard law. But so far there hasn't been any such mishap taking place. So it's important to note that if maritime forces follow a set of defined legal instruments and a defined set of procedures, I don't think it should be an issue when it comes to countering any transgression into legitimate maritime sovereignty and rights of the coastal states. I think this is one way of addressing the gray zone, because I think the narrative so far that we hear is that you should not respond to this or that action because it will actually trick you into taking unsavory decision that will carry certain dire consequences. I think this is the sort of message or narrative that I believe Beijing is more than happy to propagate. But if you look at it from the pragmatic perspective, when it comes to dealing with a foreign transgression within your legitimate EEZ, for example, when it comes to fishing, does it matter whether the other party is a known maritime militia or is it really a group of innocent fishermen? I think this is important to highlight. You have to have the exercise of principled legal instrument that I think is what matters more. And of course, it's important to note that it's not just fait accompli we're talking about, but gray zone takes the form of a set of gradual incremental actions that erode the ability of the other party to respond over time. So one way of dealing with these gray zone activities is there must be consistency, right? Consistency on the part of the victim. In this case, for example, the Philippines, he has to continually exercise the right to carry out those patrols, the right to carry out those law enforcement activities, and there must be a diplomatic instrument to backstop it, in terms of providing protests where need be, and to respond to any contingency when necessary, and to maintain those crisis management channels with the other party. I think that will, to me, in a way, help to sort of mitigate, if not totally prevent, those gray zone actions in the long run. Thank you.
Thank you both. So let's go to a live question from Richard Mack.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Hey, two things. One, was a guy by the name of Gary Roughhead, who Blake may recognize the name. When he was Pac Fleet, initiated two operations. One, we sent out ships to be in defense of the Straits of Malacca, which I think was a was a big boon to Singapore because of all of this pirating that had been going on in that area. And secondly, he sent a hospital ship through all of the Western Pacific, offering free medical aid to a bunch of countries from the Pacific Islands all the way into Southeast Asia. Those were two, I think, wonderful things that were done that really helped the American recognition out there. And I asked this question, but I'll add to it on here. When I was SINCPAC, I had a meeting with Lee Kuan Yew, and we discussed a lot of things. I think he talked for an hour and I said 3 or 4 words. You're a tremendous man. I have great respect for him. His comment was, America needs to stay involved. If they don't, we have no way to look but north, and that's China. Does that thing still kind of stay the same as it was? Thank you very much.
So Blake, do you want to start?
You bet. Thanks very much, Richard. I agree. So the hospital ship deployment that you mentioned, actually, we've really ensconced that within a exercise framework. So we continue to do that as part of our Pacific Partnership series, and we've actually expanded that to involve cooperation from other states. So we've had, a Royal Navy officer lead that exercise in the past, and we do still do that, which is, I think you're right. It's a great exercise, and it really gets at a lot of the issues that are important. I think there's been a bit of recognition recently that needs in the South Pacific and Southeast Asia are often different, particularly in Southeast Asia, kind of getting away from the medical care aspect and doing more capacity building and cooperative activities. Medical exchanges, things like that have been really effective. This year, I think one of the really important things that we could do with that exercise would be, COVID-19 vaccinations. Finding a way to repurpose Pacific Partnership and next year. I mean, this isn't a problem that's going to be over at the end of 2021, but finding a way to use Pacific Partnership to help countries reinforce themselves against COVID-19. It's a great use for that, in my opinion. On the Lee Kuan Yew question, what a great statesman and a very apt observation, and that's, I think, why you saw Singapore offer a home to Commander Logistics Western Pacific when the Philippines elected to end U.S. access to the Philippines, to keep U.S. forces in the region. And I think in the future, hopefully we'll see an actualization of the agreement to place 4 rotationally deployed LCS in Singapore. I think Commander 7th Fleet has announced that he plans to have 8 LCS out here in the near future. And I hope that I believe that the plan is to make good on that agreement, to have 4 here. We have an important presence in Singapore. They're, a strategic partner of ours, and they have offered incredible access and support on a number of initiatives. And I think that cooperative arrangement needs to continue to deepen. Was it last year or the year before we re-signed our facilities and access agreement in Singapore, and there are things that will expand and change as that relationship grows. So yeah, absolutely key partnership and a true friend of ours in the region.
Collin, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just probably just chime in on the observation about the meeting with the then Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew. It tends to dawn upon me, whether that remark might have been sort of made as a way to, not say scare the Americans, but to somewhat warn Americans that it might actually be the case where all the regional countries may have to turn to China if one day the US decides to withdraw from the region. Assuming that is truly a genuine concern, I don't personally see it as still remaining the case today, because I think we have here various extra-regional powers outside Southeast Asia who are willing to be part of the whole picture when it comes to maintaining the current regional security architecture. We mentioned about the role played by Australia, the role played by Japan in particular, and of course the role played by India, which of course Singapore has been very active in trying to bring India into the ASEAN architecture since a long time ago. So I think given the choices that we have out there, I think it's important to note that, there is a possibility to, depend on more other interested external parties to contribute to regional peace and stability. And of course, I think it has always been an ongoing project to try to cultivate China to be a constructive player in the region. But as I mentioned earlier, there are, after all, structural and pragmatic reasons why defense and security relationship between China and some of the Southeast Asian countries cannot go beyond what has been already done. And it will require not just, the improvement in the level of trust between the two parties, but it also depends on, the extent to which the PLA is able to operate in a much more seamless fashion with, the other countries. And of course, there's always been, a sensitive issue about, leaking technology and leaking information about, CONOPS to the PLA in, having those cooperative, initiatives. So I think these are some of the factors that we consider when it comes to regarding China as the potential, stand-in for the US, if the US decides to withdraw from the region. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you both. So we're coming close to the end of our session now. So I just want to combine a few questions to throw at Blake and Collin and kind of type things up. So a couple of questions deal with China's activity in the South China Sea, specifically during the pandemic. So Amy Chu from South China Morning Post asks, has China increased its incursions into Malaysia, the Philippines, and Indonesia amid the pandemic? If yes, why? And Peter Mumford asks, what was Beijing hoping to achieve with the huge show of maritime militia force this year? It seems to have undermined China's vaccine diplomacy, he says, and arguably makes its goal of joint oil and gas exploration with the Philippines harder to achieve. So why was this the case? Was Beijing just testing the new US administration and its resolve to support the Philippines and Southeast Asia? So that's kind of, one basket of questions about why China's activity has been this way during the pandemic. And then a question from Jay Terriella asking about Japan's role and the fact that Japan is stepping down as RECAP executive director this year, which is a position that they've occupied since the center was established. So do you think this will have effects on member states' trust and cooperation if Japan no longer takes the lead? And who might take the lead instead of Japan? So maybe let's start with Collin this time, and then Blake will finish up.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Now, for these questions, perhaps I think it's important to note that the Chinese have been, carrying out those various coercive actions for some years. And in fact, if anything, what we are seeing here in terms of the difference is the intensity of those activities. I think in terms of the duration of those incidents, I think it is important to note that it has been a step up from past incidents where it tends to take place, and it tends to be, somewhat intermittent. It tends to be very short. If we consider the more recent standoffs, especially after the Scarborough Shoal incident in 2012, I think it's very clear that China is now in a position, due to its improved capacity for the maritime forces, engaging in those sustained face-off with the Southeast Asian countries. So I think we don't see necessarily, an increased frequency of those incidents of coercion, but we see here an increased tendency of these incidents to become, more prolonged in a sense. So it does actually reflect China's, comfort in its position. I mean, given its increased Coast Guard, maritime militia, and naval capacity, that it believes that, it is something that it could do to overwhelm Southeast Asian rivals due to their weaknesses in capacity. So I think this is, one particular aspect that I can talk about when it comes to China's action. Of course, the question on the maritime militia I don't necessarily see this as, fully undermining China's actions in the region. I think one reason is because China is fully aware that, for many Southeast Asian countries, South China Sea issues has never been on the top of the agenda. And by and large, it has largely been about economic development. It has largely been about getting investments, trying to get access to market. And given the current pandemic situation, I think China does see a strategic opening for itself that, carrying out vaccine diplomacy, by trying to create in-person meetings with ASEAN countries and promising continued access to Chinese market and promising that, the Chinese economic recovery is good for Southeast Asian countries does actually work. And so in some way, it does actually blunt what it's doing in the South China Sea. But as I mentioned earlier, while Southeast Asian countries do embrace the opportunity to continue to engage economically with China, they still continue to put up some resistance. So in a way, to characterize this situation is that China neither wins nor loses in a sense, but in a way, it does actually serve as a reminder to China that Southeast Asian countries can turn the other way when necessary. So in some way, it does actually, serve as a reminder for China to be very careful in trying to shape the behavior of its Southeast Asian counterparts going forward. So in a way, what I'm trying to argue is that contrary to what the mainstream media tends to portray, Southeast Asian countries do have agency to maintain a form of autonomy, something that I believe China, and for that matter, other extra-regional powers are very mindful of, and that actually works to the advantage of Southeast Asian parties as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Collin. I'll just add a couple remarks to Collin's very comprehensive response. I think the activity of the People's Armed Forces Maritime Militia and China Coast Guard during the COVID-19 pandemic, I think the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative has done some work that I don't know if it necessarily increased, but it didn't decrease, right? So they kept pressure on while the region was struggling to cope with this COVID-19 pandemic. And I think there's a couple lessons you could take from that. I think one is that China is not this galaxy brain actor that has all arms of its government coordinated. I think it's very common to see the right hand and the left hand not necessarily talking to one another. So yeah, while it might have been a great time to show, this friendly China that Xi Jinping has called for, COVID-19 would have been a great time to really make friends and help. But instead, what do? They beat down the region. They consolidated claims. They, attacked fishing vessels. They impeded freedom of navigation. And, there's kind of a good cop, bad cop, but maybe not even intentional. So yeah, I don't know if the numbers increased, but I know they didn't trail off. They kept up that pressure. And like Collin mentioned, it does show the capacity that they had both to manage COVID or ignore it if they had to keep up pressure in a time when they knew that Southeast Asia would have a hard time resisting, a harder time than normal. And then with regard to recap, I would certainly be troubled to see China take the reins at recap. I don't think that would be a positive move. That's kind of something like letting the fox have run of the hen house. They're not an actor that has proven trustworthy at sea and in building good order at sea. So seeing China take the reins at a place like recap would be truly regrettable, I think. So I don't think there will be a loss in trust in the organization just because Japan hands over leadership. I think that's actually a sign of the organization's maturity that Japan feels like it can hand that over. But I think it does create a real need for a responsible maritime power to step into that role. And hopefully that is what we see.
Yeah, if I could, jump in, on Blake's comment on recap. I think because having spoken to, the colleagues there in recap, many of them have been there, in the information sharing center for some time. And I think it is important to highlight here the dynamics. I mean, many of them have worked together for a long time. And of course, within the governing council, they have been working together, for a long time, and there is a certain level of trust that has been built up. So I don't see it necessarily a bad thing for Japan to step down, because given Japan's caution about maintaining its position in RECAP, given its pioneer role in setting up this outfit, I think Japan wouldn't have done that if it doesn't come to conclude that the level of trust that is built between the member states to RECAP is sufficient for it to run on its own with a non-Japanese leadership in that way. So I agree with Blake. I think there is some trust deficit that could actually militate against China taking over the chairmanship. I think that's going to raise some eyebrows among some member states, and it might even prompt Japan to come back to take over the reins of leadership again. But I think we have here other very competent regional powers that are able to be the chairmanship. And I think India in particular is a very good example in that sense. And of course, some other Southeast Asian countries can do the same thing as well. So it might actually be a good confidence building measure to make it a rotational leadership instead. And of course, it might actually be even better, in terms of helping to promote greater cooperation. And if anything, I say this with an eye on the potential role of Indonesia and Malaysia, because so far they have not yet signed on to RECAP, and perhaps the sort of changes made to this outfit could actually one day prompt them to rethink their decision on joining RECAP as a full member. Thank you.
Great. Well, our time is basically up. So thank you so much to our speakers today for sharing their expertise and time with us, and to the audience for joining us for today's discussion. There were many more questions than we could actually get to in the Q&A, but it was a great discussion. So before we close, I wanted to mention that Pacific Forum also invites you to attend the final session of its US-Singapore Cyber and Tech Security virtual series, also held with support from the US Embassy Singapore. And that's happening tomorrow at 3:00 p.m. Hawaii time. So the link to register for that can be found in the chat now. And with that, I'll conclude. Thanks again to our speakers and to everyone who joined us today.